We are in Romans chapter 8, verses 18 to 30, and what I want to talk about is what Paul shows us about suffering, part 1. There are two places in life where you kind of want to slow down and take in every detail. One is a wedding, because everything is beautiful, everything is special. The other, where you naturally slow down, take everything in, it's a crime scene or an accident, because everything is awful. Romans 8 is a place where we need to slow down, because Romans 8 is all about suffering, and suffering is awful. And I realize it's even harder to talk about suffering when it's fresh. So think of it. Right now, Melanie is going through brain cancer. Malachi and Jordan just lost custody of Leah. Okay? The sisters don't know when they're going to see their sister. It never feels like a good time to talk about suffering, but here we are in the text, and here we are in life, and so here we go today. All right? 3 things I want to talk about this morning, and this is really just to kind of get us into this passage. We're going to take 2 weeks to go through it. So really today, I'm just kind of looking at verses 18 through about 25. All right, part 1. Here's what I want to talk about today. Number 1, why is it important to talk about suffering? Number 2, what are some problems when we talk about suffering? Number 3 things Paul shows us about suffering from the text, all right? Pretty simple. We're going to discuss it over lunch. So, number 1, why is it important to talk about suffering? I'm going to give you a couple of reasons. First of all, learning. When we go through suffering, we almost always learn something about ourselves, about the world, about life. We learn something that we never would have learned otherwise. So suffering actually presents some sort of opportunity. Second, in addition to learning, there's an outcome. When most people, this is what I want you to hear this. When most people experience suffering in this world, do you know what happens? What it produces in them is anxiety, frustration, anger, bitterness, and eventually despair. Okay? And what that does is it causes them to avoid suffering because of the pain, agony, and bitterness that it produces, which means that they will struggle to enter into the suffering of others. You follow me? That is how most people in this world respond to suffering. But when some people experience suffering, what it produces in them, it's not happiness necessarily, but it produces appreciation. It produces gratitude. Like they start focusing on things they're grateful for. It produces resolve. They're like, you know what? I'm going to keep on pressing on. It produces joy. Not at the suffering, but they find things to be joyful about. What all of that enables is for them to endure suffering in spite of the pain, and that in turn allows them to move into the suffering of others. Now listen, let me just imagine something for a second. Let's pretend that you were in a lab doing a science experiment, okay? And you mixed up your chemicals and you put it on the cooker, and 99 times out of 100, as you like cook this solution and it boils and bubbles and churns, what you get is a charred black piece of gunk, right? 99 out of 100 times, that's what happens. But 1 out of 100 times, you actually get something that turns into gold, diamond, glory. If that were to happen, you know what you'd do? you'd be doing a whole lot of experimenting to figure out what is it about that one time out of 100 that actually produces something beautiful. And what I'm saying to you is that in the history of this world, you can find people that experience suffering, and as they get squeezed and burned, what comes out of them is glory. It's gold. It's diamonds. And we ought to all be going, how do I get that? Because all of us experience suffering. In other words, if there's people like this, we would say, I want to study this. Maybe there is a secret to suffering well. So first of all, learning. Second of all, there's an outcome. Third, maturity. And I'm actually talking about maturity of faith here. When we encounter passages that challenge us or make us unsettled, Romans 8 is an example, but Romans 9 is really going to be an example, okay? It is very easy, this is what most Americans do. Oh, that passage is just wrong about God or about life or about the world. It's just wrong. That's one option. But another option is maybe we could rethink our assumptions and say, what if my assumptions about God and life are wrong and maybe they need refining? Which of those approaches is more open and enlightened and actually seeking? I'd say the second one is. A weak faith is so brittle and fragile that it can't even hear, listen, or consider anything that might unsettle it. But a strong faith is so robust and mature. It doesn't necessarily have the answers for everything, but a strong faith actually says, I am so confident in the character, quality, and goodness of God, I can trust Him, that I can handle any data. Hard passages, let me get in and wrestle with them. Hard life, let me get in and wrestle with that. Even if I'm not sure how it all fits together. So part of the reason this passage is so important and part of the reason suffering is so important is because we live in a culture that doesn't think very deeply and doesn't wrestle very deeply with suffering, and as a result, we struggle to enter into it. We struggle to bear it when it happens to us. We struggle to enter into it for the sake of other people. And it's not because our faith is strong, it's because our faith is weak and untested. So what I want to invite us to do, this is why it's so important. I think there's something to learn. There's an outcome that we might be interested in. No matter what it does, it will grow up your faith. It is good to examine what you believe and to say, why do I believe this? And it's good to press into passages that are, you don't want to just press into passages that comfort you and prop you up. Any faith that says that is actually offering you a reductionistic faith. The Bible calls us to press in and actually wrestle with all of reality. It wants us to turn on our brains. And we need to do that when it comes to suffering. So that's why suffering is important. Second thing, there are some problems in talking about suffering. Lots of problems. But one of the biggest problems, it's not the problem of evil, it's the problem of us. Now here's what I mean by this. We tend to be cynical about suffering when we're on the outside of it. Or we tend to be hypersensitive about suffering when we're in the middle of it. It's like me getting a crown at the dentist office last week. Now, I have friends. You guys know what a crown is? Okay, yeah, okay, suffering. No, listen, I have friends who are like, oh, a crown, that's not that bad. All right? Seriously. Carrie, she's like, a crown's not that bad. And the first part wasn't, okay? Because they go in and they numb you. But what they do when you get do you know what it is when you get a crown? They basically, you have like a crack in your tooth. And so they grind your tooth all the way down to just barely above the gum line. Yeah, exactly. I'm having like a hypersensitive just thinking about it. This happened last week. Well, 2 weeks ago, they ground it all down. Last week, the crown came in. So I go back. And all they're going to do is take the cap that they've like engineered to perfectly fit your tooth. And they push it in there and they're like, okay, no problem. All right. But here's what the person says. They're like, number one, this is no big deal. You're not going to need, like, seriously, because all the hard work's been done, right? And then whatever the person is, who's not even the dentist is like, you might feel a little discomfort. Okay, now here, they put it in. I'm like, no, it feels pretty good. Everything fits. Then what they do, right at the very end, when they put the glue on it, they drop it in some solution. I don't know if it's alcohol. I don't know if it's super cold. I don't know what it is, but it sanitizes it and it makes it so the glue sticks. And when they put that thing in there, it felt like somebody took a railroad spike and like drove it into my brain. And I'm like, ah! Okay, now here's what I want to. They weren't actually doing anything painful. But there's a nerve right there. And the nerve is really, really sensitive. And what I'm getting at is a lot of times we have that same reaction when we are in the middle of suffering. You just say, get a crown. And I'm like, I tense up. We have a tendency to be oversensitive because of the exposed nerves. Or when we're on the outside of it, we're like, oh, it's no big deal. We don't really need to talk about it. You see what I'm saying? Inside of it, we can't talk about it now. I'm in pain. Outside of it, it's not that big of a deal. We don't really need to talk about it or think about it. When are we going to talk about it or think about it? Right now. When we come to Paul, when we come to Romans 8, it is easy to have a knee-jerk reaction and say, suffering, why are we talking about this? Why is Paul talking about this? Or to just experience pain and to go, I can't look at this passage right now. Okay? One of those tends to be a little cynical. One of them tends to be hypersensitive. What I want to say to you about this passage is if you take this passage, somebody like Malachi or Jordan or Esther, okay, and say, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed in us. Okay, because the pain's really fresh right now, that may feel shallow. Okay? I'm not saying that what you do is anytime you see somebody suffering, you grab this passage and say, oh, let me read you a quick verse. It's going to make your life better. I'm not saying that. What I'm actually saying is that Paul says things in this passage. When you have actually sat in suffering for a long time, if it's really, really fresh, this passage may not be helpful. But when you have sat in suffering for a very long time, I actually think this passage is tremendously helpful because you start to look not just for relief, but for answers. And what you realize is Paul is somebody who has himself suffered. Okay? So what I want to encourage us is Paul's answer is actually going to land as a kind of relief for a long sufferer, just like the dentist was a relief for me. Listen, I know when they put that crown on, I'm like, oh, this is probably going to hurt. But I also know it's going to get better. And that allows me to go through with it. And afterwards to be able to look back on it and process it. So let's dive into the text, keeping an eye out both for cynicism and hypersensitivity. If you look at verse 18, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed to us. It's easy to roll your eyes and say, sounds like Paul's saying suffering's not so bad. And to think, tell that to someone who's suffering, Paul. Look at verse 28. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do, that's 26. 28. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. Listen, think about telling that to Melanie's kids right now. Think about telling it to Malachi's kids right now. That may, if you jump straight to that verse, you can see how it might sound trite or be received that way. Okay? And that's true. To someone fresh into suffering, is probably going to find it hard. But in my experience, somebody who has been suffering has earned the right to say it, who has been through suffering. And here's what I want to tell you. Paul is somebody who suffered greatly for what he believed. So when Paul says something about suffering, we should actually go, you know what? I'm going to at least listen to what he has to say. Okay? Someone who has dwelt in suffering long term might actually be interested in that point of view here. So when we speak to people about suffering, in the midst of suffering, we need to take their suffering seriously, but we also need to take Paul seriously. Okay, those are that's why it's important. Those are some of the problems to be aware about. Now let's actually look at 3 things Paul shows us about suffering. And these are really interesting. First of all, suffering is preparatory. It prepares us for something. If you look at verse 18, I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed in us. Paul says something is coming, and he calls it glory. And something about that thing that is coming is so good, so significant, that it will actually completely reorder our experience of badness, which is what we call suffering. In other words, it will make all the badness, all the hardness, all the grief, and all the ache feel like a light breeze instead of a howling gale. And as I say that, I guarantee you some of you are like, yeah, right. Cynical. Don't be cynical here. Think about this. Listen. Do you hear what I'm saying? The Bible is saying that suffering is preparing something for us, or preparing us for something. There's a purpose in it. Let me give you a more explicit passage than this one. 2 Corinthians 4:17 says this. I'll read 16 too. We do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. In other words, Paul is saying there is something about affliction, about suffering, that is actually preparing something for us, or preparing us for something, preparing for us an eternal weight of glory. And all I want to ask right now is, listen, what if that could be true? Do you realize how significantly that would change how we would move through life? Instead of avoiding suffering, or being afraid of suffering, or being angry at suffering, or being anxious about suffering, we could actually endure it. We could look at it. I'm not saying we seek it out, but the point is, it would give us a capacity to be stronger. All right? Now listen. Paul thinks something's coming. What's your view of what's coming? Do you know why most people, suffering is such a big deal? Because we don't think anything else is coming. We think this is the real thing right here. Paul has a view that looks ahead, and he says something about suffering is actually preparing for us an eternal weight of glory. You want to learn more about that phrase, eternal weight of glory? I'd encourage you to go read C.S. Lewis. He's got a little essay called The Eternal Weight of Glory. I've got it on my shelf. You can look it up online. It is phenomenal. All right? I think part of the reason so many of us find this so difficult is our view of what's coming is flimsy, shallow vaporware. Paul's got a different view of what's coming. So that's the first thing. Paul wants to show us that suffering is preparing us for something, glory. Second thing, creation experiences suffering too. If you look back at Romans chapter 8, look at verse 19. The creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. Now listen, I'm going to kind of jump through a bunch of verses here. Here's what Paul is saying. Over the next 4 or 5 verses, they are all about creation. The way that Paul talks about creation, all created things, it's almost like they're alive. They're waiting. Let me rephrase that. Not just beings, not just people, but it's like Paul is looking at creation, like the sun and the moon and the stars, the land, the dirt, the earth, the animals, everything in it, and saying it's all waiting for something. It's all alive. It's all conscious in some sense. Okay, this passage actually gives more insight into the Christian worldview on matter and cosmos than any other passage in the Bible. There's no other passage in the Bible that has this many references to creation in this condensed of a span, where it's actually telling us something about it. So what's Paul say? Creation waits. Okay? Sun, moon, sky, animals. All right? Stars, earth, water, sea, people, creation. It's all waiting. Then he says this in verse 20. Creation was subjected to futility. He's almost certainly talking about the fall here. Genesis chapter 3. Something happened. And this is really, really important, because what that means is that suffering is not natural. It is not like just the way God created. God created a world full of suffering. No, something happened. Creation is waiting because it was subjected to a futility. Now listen, if you read this text and you say, who subjected it? It's not clear. 3 possibilities. Could be Adam, could be Satan, could be God. Probably God. But the point of what he's saying is that the subjection was not, when he says not willingly, he's saying creation, suffering was not what creation was built for. Okay? Think about this. What that means is that creation, according to Paul's view, was actually built to be a world where there is no suffering. But there does seem to be an allowance or possibility of suffering. And you go, why would that be? What kind of defective world is that? And the answer, C.S. Lewis is probably going to say that, is so that man can have agency and opportunity to be free. In other words, he created a world with capacity for both perfection but also fall. And he put man in it and gave him an agency and said, I am going to give you freedom and power and potency. And if you run this right, you're going to move through to perfection. But if you get this wrong, it's not just going to screw you up in your personal relationship with me. It's going to screw up your kids. It's going to screw up humanity. And it's actually going to do something to the entire world. Okay? Things don't work the way they're supposed to. True for creation, true for us, true for our lives. Creation hopes. So creation waits. Creation was subjected, down in verse 21. Creation hopes. It yearns for a freedom from bondage to corruption. The Bible is very clear, I just said this, but that suffering is not part of creation. There's a passage that's worth reading, Revelation 21. When the new city, New Jerusalem, comes down from heaven. This is verse 3 to 5. I heard a loud voice from behind the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. City's coming down. Okay? God himself will dwell with him. They will be his people. God himself will be with them as their God. Now listen to this. Do you know what God does when he finally brings the kingdom in its fullness and dwells with people here on earth? He himself will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death shall be no more. Neither shall be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. Do you see that? The vision in Scripture is that God himself is entering in to do something about suffering in this world. So right now creation waits. It has been subjected, but it hopes, it yearns, it groans. Down in verse 22. That's what suffering feels like, is a groan. That is what I felt all last night and all this morning as I sit here thinking about Leia and going, I don't know when I'm ever going to see her again. Knowing that her dad wants her to have zero contact with any of us. Okay? Hopefully with Esther. But do you feel the groan in that? Paul is saying creation groans too. And then he says this. This is interesting. He said the groaning is like childbirth. For those of you who are married and who have had children, to be in the room while your wife is delivering, you hear a woman groan. And what Paul is saying is that groaning is actually a birthing process. In other words, the groans that you feel right now are God producing something in you that's going to be new creation, or it can be, for people who are in him. And then he uses language of adoption. So it's very interesting. He talks about childbirth and adoption, both in the same breath almost. And he connects this to us down in verse 23. We groan. We're part of creation too. So we experience the same futility, the same groaning, the same suffering, and we wait. But the thing that we're waiting for is adoption as sons. We're actually waiting for him to do something for ourselves that we can't do, for us, that we can't do for ourselves. Redemption bodies. Salvation is not merely spiritual or inward or like heavenly. Very, very material. It's connected to all of creation. We hope too, verse 24. And the Holy Spirit is the installment of that hope. So here's the second thing I want you to see. The first one is that suffering is preparatory, or it can be. The second one is that creation experiences suffering too, and it's actually a birthing process. All right? Third, so Paul wants us to be hopeful. In the Christian worldview, suffering is not natural. It's not the default state. It's not just the way things are or the way things are meant to be. Let me give you a couple of examples. Naturalism. This is like materialism, scientificism. In other words, people who say, look, I don't believe in anything that I can't touch, see, feel, taste, measure. This world is it. Why should we believe in a world to come? This is just what we got. Matter, physical. This world is it, so enjoy it while you can. There are a lot of people that really believe that. Suffering happens. That's just part of reality. The strong eat the weak. Okay? Better learn to run fast. It helps. Suffering happens less if you're rich, powerful, beautiful, or successful. So take what you can, get what you can, enjoy it while you can, but do whatever you can to avoid suffering. That is a materialistic worldview. That is what you see in most of your friends. Most of the people in this world, they are living as if this world is it. Okay? What about Buddhism? Buddhism actually says that the problem with suffering is you. Your problem is you have a problem with suffering. You need to get over that. You shouldn't. Okay? Just detach. Stop expecting a world without suffering. Embrace suffering. Just is. But that view will never lead you to embrace suffering in the sense of getting involved in suffering on behalf of others to help them overcome it and get out of it. In other words, if you buy a Buddhist view, it's not going to lead you to dive in to the suffering in this world. It's actually going to lead you to kind of check out and just detach. Okay? That's Buddhism. Hinduism, karma, reincarnation. I know that it sounded great in college, okay? But the problem with incarnation, well, let me say it this way, reincarnation. The problem with Hinduism, the problem with suffering is you did something to deserve it. Okay? Suffering is punishment. That's what karma is. You get what you had coming. What goes around comes around. So people who are suffering now must have done something in a former life to deserve it, so they're getting what they're deserved. This is just suffering. So when you see people in a poor caste, their life is misery, you don't get involved to lift them out of it. They need to learn something from it. They were bad in a former life. They deserved it. That's what I'm saying. Hinduism, karma, does not drive you into mercy and compassion for people in the midst of suffering. Why on the earth would you ever interfere? Christianity, as far as I know, is the only faith on the planet that says the God who created the universe is doing something in this world through suffering, but also about suffering, and it's happening by him embracing suffering himself, putting it on and suffering so that others don't have to. Okay? Therefore, we should be too. Christianity drives people in the direction of suffering on behalf of others. Christianity is the only faith that says suffering is redemptive, or can be, when it's embraced and endured and entered the right way. Christianity says the comfort is real, so hope is possible. Let me read you one more verse. We're just about done here. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Verses 3 and 4, 5. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies, the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction. Listen to this. He's saying God comforts his children in all our afflictions, so, you hear the purpose? That we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction. In other words, as you go through suffering, let's say you're going through cancer. Well, guess what? You will be able to comfort other people who are going through cancer. But Scripture says more than that. You will be able to comfort people in any kind of suffering, not just your particular flavor. There is something you can learn about something. You can experience comfort in the midst of suffering because you know that God is with you. He has not abandoned you. There is a purpose, and that should give us hope. We can know comfort. The purpose behind it is that we might be able to be a comfort to other people with the comfort that we ourselves are comforted by God. For as we share abundantly in Christ's sufferings, so through Christ we share abundantly in comfort too. What the text really teaches, I'm not going to try to unpack this for you, is that when Christians embrace suffering, not seek it out, that's called foolishness, okay? But when Christians embrace the suffering that God allows to enter their lives, they can experience God's comfort. They can learn something that they can actually share with other people that will bring them comfort as well. And they learn how to endure suffering in a way that allows them to enter in and sit in the dust beside them, which is exactly what Christ did for us. Christianity says Christ began to end suffering by entering, giving, trusting, suffering on the cross for the sake of others. You can continue what Christ began. And as you do that, you actually know Christ better, and you become an agent of comfort, compassion, and hope for the people around you. Okay? That's what we're called into. So, here's 4 questions we can talk about over lunch. Number 1, what does Paul say about suffering that just like lands with you? Did you hear something in here? Number 2, what do you have to say about suffering? Like if you've got to write your own version of Laura chapter 8, what would your version, what would you have to say? What's your worldview about suffering? Do you have one? Okay. It's easy to be critical or cynical, but how do we be thoughtful? Let's hear it. Let's talk about that. So number 1, what did Paul say that maybe landed or stood out to you? What would you say? Your own views. What do you have to offer people in their suffering? Is it just like, oh, I hope it gets better? Or do you actually have to offer something? Like, is there something that you've experienced? When you see somebody suffering, what do you offer them? If it's just sympathy, that's not super helpful. Paul is offering more than sympathy. 4, what's your response in the face of suffering? How do you respond to the suffering around you? When it comes upon you, do you run away from it or do you embrace it? When you see it in people around you, do you look the other direction? Do you change lanes? Do you start going, in a new way so you just don't see those people anymore? Or do you move into it with them? All right? Those are some of the things we're going to talk about over lunch. With that, I'm going to wash my hands and we're going to come to the Lord's Supper.